My recollection is somewhat hazy, dating back to when I was quite young, perhaps 6 years old in my old residence. My living space occupied the uppermost level. Originally, it wasn't designated as sleeping quarters. It felt more like an extension of the attic or a simple storage area. The prior occupants had utilized it as a workshop for their sons. My room also featured a large entryway into the loft space, accessible via a set of steep steps. It had a bulky rolling entrance panel and was absolutely crammed with outdated playthings and assorted clutter from my early years. Since I was quite small then, I always felt uneasy being so isolated from the rest of my kin, especially with that imposing entry point in my room. Then, on a particular evening, I was restless in bed, feeling apprehensive following viewing a frightening film with my family. Suddenly, I distinctly heard the noise of a bouncing orb from up in the loft space. I leapt from my mattress and rushed to my parents' chambers. They assured me nothing was inside my cupboard. Perceiving my intense fear, they permitted me to stay in their sleeping area for the night. The subsequent evening, the initial unease had somewhat subsided until the peculiar sound returned. It was the distinctive rattle of tiny plastic pieces scattering from up in the loft space again. I again hurried to my parents' space and informed them. My father's patience was noticeably thinning. He hesitantly consented to letting me stay in their sleeping area once more. The following day, my mother and I inspected the cupboard, and sure enough, a scattering of the plastic bricks lay across the surface, having apparently tumbled from their container. I interpreted this as confirmation that someone had been inside my cupboard, but my mother calmly suggested it had merely tipped. That same night, my father secured his door. He declared himself weary of my perceived silliness. Rest remained elusive for me that night. I remained perfectly still, my childish apprehension stirring, anticipating further noise from the cupboard. Likely an hour elapsed before the event occurred. It shattered the stillness, the heavy scrape of the access panel forcefully retracting. The lunar glow filtering through my window revealed a shape positioned beside the entry panel. I emitted an utterly terrifying, piercing shriek, the most horrific you can imagine, as unadulterated dread washed over me, a sensation that remains vivid to this day. The shape descended from the loft area and hastened from my room and exited the main portal of my residence. My mother ascended swiftly to my room in shock, while my father dashed below attempting to apprehend the intruder, yet he was unsuccessful. Law enforcement never located the individual. During my sophomore year of high school, I participated in a group excursion focused on historical locations in the southern part of the state, and among the destinations was a property known as Oakwood Estate, rumored to be among the nation's most spectrally active sites. Numerous tales circulate about the place, but at one point we were gathered in a chamber with a sizable assembly, and our guide was lecturing about something I don't recall. As I was standing there, I began perceiving a sound akin to a single strike on a keyboard instrument. After hearing it a couple of times, my gaze began scanning around for the source. No such instrument was visible, yet the sound persisted, so I inquired of my companions nearby if they also detected the noise. Their response was negative. Upon hearing it once more, I declared, "There it is, again." They must have heard it that time. They apparently found my claim dubious, so I returned my attention to scanning the surroundings. All attention was fixed on the guide save for one female participant. She caught my notice and motioned towards me, then her ear with an inquisitive expression. I understood she was inquiring if I shared the auditory experience, and I affirmed with a nod. Just then the guide commenced relating an account concerning a former inhabitant, a composer who had perished tragically at the site, and how numerous visitors had previously reported hearing musical renditions during nocturnal hours. Truthfully, I was quite bewildered. I suppose that feeling remains. I engaged in conversation with the woman as the group dispersed from the chamber, and she confirmed hearing the identical phenomenon. However, her spouse and offspring had perceived nothing. Around the time of autumn, my companions and I were exchanging unsettling narratives. One friend mentioned she'd recount a tale pertaining to her father's initial rendezvous with her mother. She confessed she found the telling discomforting as the account was factually accurate. However, we encouraged her to get to the salient points. The introductory meeting between her parents was pleasant, albeit slightly stilted, and as the moment arrived for parting pleasantries, the gentleman in question, her father, proposed they embark on a nocturnal stroll up Blackwood Pass. He seemed familiar with the locale, having spent considerable time exploring trails there. Thus the pair drove towards the canyon's entrance, exited their vehicles, and began traversing the path with only minimal starlight due to the cloudy sky. Shortly thereafter, the gentleman began experiencing a sense of dread as the trail ahead, shaded by foliage, grew dark and the hour was advancing. He disregarded the sensation and continued forward. Minutes later, the feeling resurfaced. Ignoring it once more, he proceeded further into the shaded area when his foot stumbled upon something yielding directly on the trail beneath the branches. Visibility was too low to discern the nature of the soft obstruction, and the ominous feeling intensified. Rather than investigating what he had encountered, he and the lady mutually decided to retreat swiftly from there. Numerous years passed, and they were long married, when they viewed a televised interview with a notorious individual, a serial offender known for similar crimes. When queried about a moment where he felt most vulnerable to apprehension, he recounted an evening when he had enticed a young woman into Blackwood Pass and had just committed the act when sounds of approaching individuals reached him from the trail. He detailed concealing himself among the trees with mere moments to spare, only to observe a gentleman inadvertently stepping directly onto the remains and, for reasons unknown, simply reversing direction and departing. The library at my university remains accessible until 1:30 a.m., catering to those, myself included, who defer major paper deadlines. It's a relatively compact structure, and the majority of the collection resides in the subterranean zone known as the lower level. For a brief spatial context, a central staircase descends to this area. There's also a small beverage area and a lengthy corridor providing multiple access points into the lower level. The lower level itself comprises two expansive chambers situated on opposing sides of the corridor, containing a vast quantity of bookshelves and study carrels inset into the walls. I was present there close to midnight last year. I was engaged in crafting a particularly research-heavy paper. Hence, I was occupied in one of the work carrels within the lower level, avoiding repeated ascents and descents. I'd been working for perhaps an hour and a half, and everyone else had departed, save for another student a few carrels away from me. My focus was considerably diminished by this point. The submission was for an early morning class, leaving limited time, and a sense of urgency was building. Consequently, I became annoyed upon hearing the sound of someone rapidly rifling through book pages, producing a loud fluttering noise from the room's opposite end. I initially tried to disregard it, assuming the activity would cease, but the noise persisted. After roughly 5 minutes, my patience wore thin and I began moving to investigate. I had taken only a few steps when the noise abruptly ceased. I resumed my seat and quiet returned, lasting only about a quarter hour before the page rustling sound recommenced, significantly louder this time, as if they had seized a massive tome. The other student also appeared agitated and stood proceeding through the aisles, searching for the source. As the sound continued, I also rose and joined the search. The volume increased substantially, and its point of origin became quite apparent. Thus we moved in its direction. He took one side of the book stacks, and I took the other. We traversed the entire length of the shelves. No one was present. We hadn't observed anyone entering the lower level, and we were situated near the access points. Entry without our notice seemed impossible. The sound stopped again, and we both slowly returned to our positions. I reasoned it was likely something mechanical in an adjacent area, and my paper required completion. We were barely seated when the noises immediately resumed. It seemed to emanate from right beside the other student's seating area. He rapidly gathered his belongings, glanced at me, uttered something like, "That's it," and swiftly departed. I was likely out of there within 5 seconds of his exit. To this day, I avoid the lower level after dark, even when other individuals are present. This event transpired back when I still possessed my small trawler. It was an utterly terrifying ordeal that neither of us will ever forget. My companion and I set out from the southern coast for a multiple-day fishing excursion. The initial day and evening proceeded without incident. We secured a respectable haul, and during the evening we engaged in board games with background music. It was pleasant until the subsequent night. Following a slow day of trawling, we were again inside, playing games absent the music this time. It was then that the distinctive thrumming of a vessel's engine reached us. We hurried to the deck and observed an individual maneuvering a dilapidated small craft entirely devoid of illumination. He had halted immediately ahead of our vessel's forward section. The individual appeared middle-aged with facial hair and a weathered cap. I approached and inquired if he required assistance. He asked if we carried any extra fuel. I responded regretfully that we did not. I asked the gentleman if he was running low and if he needed transport back to land, but he refused. He asserted he possessed ample fuel, which led to a stilted silence as my companion and I pondered the reason for his query in that case. The silence began to feel unsettling to both of us, primarily due to his blank, unwavering gaze directed at me. The only illumination was from the forward lamp on our craft. Apart from that, we were enveloped in complete darkness. The man eventually broke the quietude, asking if our day's trawling had been fruitful. I replied negatively, attempting to maintain politeness despite the peculiar and unsettling nature of the encounter. I asked the individual how he managed navigation in the darkness, but he responded only with a low chuckle as though I had made a jest. I assumed he hadn't understood my meaning. He pivoted his small craft, and his final words to us were, "Pleasure encountering you." He then motored away into the absolute blackness surrounding us. My companion and I were thoroughly unsettled. My companion confessed she was concerned he intended theft. As someone engaged in seafaring, you frequently encounter and interact with fellow boaters and those in the trade, but I sensed something distinctly amiss about that individual. The late hour, the distance from land, being solitary in that small vessel, and his peculiar demeanor. We both felt profoundly uneasy, so I decided to extinguish our exterior lamps and alter our course slightly northward, ensuring the individual couldn't easily relocate us. Perhaps call it overly cautious. Later that night, likely around 0200 hours, I awoke to the profoundly disturbing and terrifying shriek of my companion. I bolted upright from my sleeping position and observed a figure standing at the edge of our bunk. I leapt from the bunk towards the individual, but he was already exiting the small cabin before I could fully clear the space. I then heard the familiar sound of the small craft's engine igniting before it rapidly moved away into the darkness once more. We sailed back to land that very night and immediately alerted the authorities regarding the individual. Naturally, no further information ever surfaced regarding the matter. We still possess no understanding of the man's intentions or what he planned to do. But the experience continues to trouble my sleep. The configuration of my sleeping area was such that opposite my bunk, there was a small recessed area which remained unlit because a large wardrobe slightly obscured it. Consequently, the wardrobe impeded both the overhead fixture and external ambient light in darkness. I was in my final year of secondary schooling and found sleep elusive, that familiar feeling of being watched. I was experiencing it intensely and couldn't dispel it, and the sense emanating from whatever was observing me felt profoundly malevolent. I parted my eyelids, and my sight was immediately pulled towards that darkened section of the chamber where I perceived an indistinct darker form within. A chill ran down my spine, yet I dismissed it, attributing it to mere imagination. I reclosed my eyes, attempting to compel myself towards slumber, but the oppressive sensation of that malevolent gaze persisted. Then a faint creak sounded, a noise indicative of weight being placed upon the floorboards. I opened my eyes once more, and that shadowy entity was now positioned in the far corner. My every internal alarm blared, and I pulled my pillow and covers over my head, weeping until exhaustion overcame me, all the while praying that the entity would not approach further. I am certain I neither imagined nor dreamt the event, and it still causes me profound discomfort. It marked the inaugural camping excursion for my family. I was 19 years of age then. We likely wouldn't have embarked if not for my younger brother and sister, twins aged 9. It was late summer, and I was genuinely anticipating it. We journeyed into a rural region. We bypassed designated campsites. My father simply pulled the vehicle over on the verge of a quiet lane, and we walked roughly a kilometer into the forest until locating a modest clearing. We erected 2 temporary shelters, one for myself and my siblings and one for my parents. Consequently, upon nightfall, sleep proved impossible for me. Attempting to rest within that sleeping bag felt akin to lying directly on the ground. I simply couldn't find repose. I shifted and adjusted for hours, seeking comfort. My younger siblings had been asleep for a considerable duration by then. And then I detected the sound of the shelter's fastener sliding open. I looked upwards and saw an individual's head partially entering the shelter. I couldn't discern their identity. "Father?" I whispered. Whoever it was withdrew their head from within the shelter. "Father!" I repeated louder. The person rapidly retreated from the shelter, leaving it unfastened. I was utterly perplexed. I was certain it was either my mother or father checking on us, so I emerged from my shelter and proceeded to my parents' temporary dwelling. I unfastened it and entered. Both my parents were settled within their sleeping bags. I roused my father by shaking him and asked if he had just come to check on us. He replied negatively. A chill went through me upon his response. I then roused my mother, hoping it had been her, but she groggily confirmed she hadn't exited the shelter either. Goosebumps covered me entirely as the understanding dawned. An unknown individual had approached our shelter, opened the fastener, and peered inside. A complete unknown, potentially unstable. I honestly couldn't gauge if my parents fully grasped the gravity, or perhaps I simply don't recall their reaction precisely. But I vividly remember remaining awake for the entirety of that night. My parents were on their post-wedding trip to a tropical island. Upon arriving at their resort accommodations to register, they were informed the assigned chamber was non-smoking. Given my father's preference for a different type of atmosphere, they requested alternative quarters. Their assignment was changed, and they proceeded to their new room. Stepping off the lift, a strong scent of wet paint was potent down the corridor. Further along the passage, a maintenance worker was actively painting a wall. With all requisite implements and materials spread about, as my parents walked by, they offered a casual greeting, and the worker offered absolutely no response or acknowledgement. Inside their chamber, the paint odor was even more intense to an unbearable degree. Thus, they resolved to return to the front desk and change rooms. When they described the circumstance, the attendant appeared considerably perplexed and stated there was no maintenance work scheduled for that specific level that day, but consented to reassigning them regardless. My parents returned to the floor to retrieve their baggage, and the worker was completely gone, all implements cleaned up and vanished within just a few minutes, and the paint scent had entirely disappeared at this point. My parents felt unsettled but tried not to dwell on it excessively and proceeded to their new accommodations. The following morning, en route to breakfast, they overheard a guide addressing a group. My parents paid attention when the guide mentioned the level they were initially assigned. Apparently, long ago, a worker was painting on that floor and fell down the lift shaft, perishing. Ordinarily, my parents are not believers in the paranormal, but following an inexplicable event like this, it left them quite shaken. This account didn't occur directly to me. It was experienced by my close relative Arthur, and yet the recollection still causes me considerable unease. This narrative is disturbingly factual. My relative Arthur was engaged in a video call with his partner Alara late on a weekend evening around 0100. She was inviting him to visit and stay over, but he was reluctant to drive that late. Partway through the discussion, Arthur noticed the storage cupboard door behind Ilara was slightly ajar. Arthur drew attention to it, and she turned to look at the cupboard. They both ultimately disregarded it. Perhaps 20 minutes later in the call, the cupboard door audibly creaked open further. Arthur observed it again and suggested Ilara's younger sibling must be concealed within the cupboard. She denied this and claimed a window was open or similar, causing a draft. Maybe another half-hour elapsed when the cupboard door fully opened, and an individual stepped out and exited Ilara's chamber. Ilara didn't appear to register this, but Arthur was significantly taken aback by what he had witnessed. He repeated that her younger sibling was in her cupboard, but her subsequent statement utterly terrified Arthur. She informed him she was the sole occupant of the residence that evening. Arthur began shouting at the screen, urging her to secure her entrance and contact emergency services, assuring her he would arrive as quickly as possible. Ilara was only beginning to comprehend the gravity as she turned and saw the fully open cupboard door. She bolted to her chamber's entrance and emitted a piercing cry before violently closing the door and securing it. Arthur drove with urgency towards her location while simultaneously contacting law enforcement. Upon his arrival, the main entrance was found unsecured, so he rushed inside and proceeded to Ilara's chamber. He knocked on the entrance, identifying himself, but she remained unresponsive. When authorities finally arrived, they forced entry to find her huddled in a corner of the room, in a state of shock. She later relayed to the police that she had seen an individual positioned directly in front of her at the threshold just before closing the entrance. It was a deeply dark and tempestuous evening, the sort of storm I found appealing, with rumbling thunder and flashes of lightning. Consequently, I was staying up late viewing films. I resided with my father, but he was absent that night, as he was on nocturnal shifts anyway. Having just completed watching a classic film for what felt like the 100th time, I decided that approaching 200 hours was a suitable time for repose. I found drifting off during electrical storms quite soothing to listen to, but abruptly I heard a distinct tap against my window pane. It wasn't the drumming of precipitation, but amid such a heavy downpour I dismissed it and returned my head to the pillow. Yet mere seconds later the identical sound returned, something striking the pane once more. This time I identified the sound as a stone hitting the glass. My pulse quickened rapidly. It couldn't be my father. He would have contacted me if anything was amiss. Another stone struck the window. I felt utterly immobilized on my bed. I was reluctant to look outside, but whoever was outside surely knew I was present. I had just extinguished the television. They could have observed the bright illumination through the pane. I simply resolved that if I paid no attention, they would depart. Another stone hit, then another. The frequency was accelerating. The downpour began to ease, and that's when I heard the engine sound of a utility vehicle running below on the street. A much heavier thud against the window was where I decided this was the limit. I rose from my bunk intending to alert the authorities. I raced downstairs towards the telephone, but as I went by the main entrance, I glimpsed something through the small glass panel at the top of the door. It was a human visage peering inwards at me. It appeared to wear a smile. I dashed to the kitchen and telephoned the police. They advised an officer was in proximity and should arrive soon. Whoever was at the entrance began attempting to manipulate the latch and eventually commenced forcefully striking the door, trying to breach it. I seized a kitchen implement for protection and shouted that the police were en route before ascending rapidly back to my chamber. After roughly a minute, the forceful impacts on the door ceased and no more stones struck my window. I still didn't venture to look outside, but I recall hearing the sound of the utility vehicle driving away a few minutes later. Moments later, I heard the distant sound of a police siren outside, followed by the doorbell ringing. I recounted the entire sequence of events to the responding officer. I described the visage to the best of my ability. Regrettably, I couldn't offer any details regarding the vehicle. I still lament not taking a quick look out the window. Insufficient information was ever available for the authorities to apprehend these individuals. I remain unsure if their intent was merely burglary or something significantly graver.